Welcome to Right on the Mark with your host, myself, Mark Young. Today, I'd like to talk about TV shows that we grew up with. A lot of the shows that we grew up with were the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. A lot of my listeners, same age as myself. You know, we grew up with, 5 or 6 channels, something like that. We didn't have cable back in the 60s, early 70s. So TV watching was kind of what you did back then. There wasn't any internet. There wasn't phones to play with. There wasn't many video games. There were some, but I think what most people did back then growing up was watch TV. You went to school and you talked about it. You came home and you're like, well, what's on TV? You know, they had a TV guide for you to view the listings. Now they have TVs that actually have a guide on the TV. So a lot of people got away from the hard copies of the TV guide. But I do still get the TV guide. It's a lot larger than what it used to be. My father keeps barrels and barrels of old TV guides. And when I go back to visit, that's one of the things that I used to do is look at all of his TV guides. And he had the small TV guides, maybe 6-inch by 8-inch TV book. And you would see what was on. There was hardly any advertising on it. It was just a grid. Basically, what came on from midnight to midnight. You know, there was very little advertising. What advertising they did have was on the front cover. So usually it was the iconic shows that they'd have on the front cover of the TV guide. Just some that come to mind is MASH, some of the All in the Family, some of the life-changing events like Jefferson's show, things like that would show up on the cover. And you thought that, it was going to be worth something. It was going to be a value later on in life that you would always treasure, almost like, a book that you would keep just in case you'd want to share it later on in life. You'd say, hey, look, there's All in the Family. Remember this show? I have the TV guide. And it would say, the date that it came out, say September 9th, 1972 or something like that. You just want to keep it and just always have it just in case, it was worth money someday. Not that you'd ever part with it because my father wouldn't part with any of those TV guides, but maybe for the right price he would. But but right now we just store it and, once in a while I'll look at those TV guides and I'll think and I'll go back and go, what was playing back in the 60s or 70s or 80s? What was on Tuesday night at 8 o'clock? You come home from grade school and you think, what am I going to watch tonight? Of course, you do your homework first. I always wanted to get that in. Got to do your homework first, kids. So from what I recall, I remember watching back in the 70s, with the limited channels that we did have. We had the CBS, we had the NBC, the ABC. We had all the big players back then, but Channel 10, WPXI came in a little bit later. Channel 22 came in later. Then all the big cable giants like TBS, TNT, USA channels came later on. But we started out in the 70s watching cartoons. I could remember my siblings and I sitting around like say Saturday or Sunday, because the cartoons were big on the weekends. Everyone was busy during the week, so you usually just watch the cartoons in the morning on Saturday and Sunday. But, I had 2 sisters and an older brother, and they tend to take over the TV. So what I would do, or what I suggested, is we all pick a half-hour show during that hour. So say you had 3 good shows on at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, we only had one TV at the time. So we all had to take our turn watching a show. So let's say I would pick Scooby-Doo. So I would pick Scooby-Doo. My brother would pick H.R. Puffin stuff. And then my older sister would pick Wacky Racers. And then that's the order that we would watch the cartoons. We didn't have a cable box back then. We didn't have a DVR back then. We didn't get a VCR until probably in the early 80s. But so you watched the show and you had to watch it all because there was no way that you were going to watch it again. So, so some of those cartoons were really good. I can remember all the Scooby-Doos, the Lidsville, Wacky Racers, Land of the Lost. A lot of those cartoons that came out back then were half hour. So they were half hour, and you would watch it from 8 to 9 or 8 to 8:30, and then something else would come on, and then you'd go get something to eat in between commercials. But you always came back to the living room because you didn't want to miss it, because if you missed it, you weren't going to get a chance to watch cartoons until the following weekend. So some of those cartoons, though, were really just wacky. I mean, I can remember watching H.R. Puff and stuff thinking, where did they come up with this stuff? But Wacky Racers was really good too. I mean, Grok and Gravel was my favorite. I think my brothers might have been Dick Dastardly. I think my sister was like, I think it was Priscilla, something like that. I can't really remember the names that were all in the Wacky Racers, but some of the names are really crazy. I mean, you had the Anthill Gang, they made like a human ladder, something like that. But we watched that, and we went about our business. We had our cinnamon rolls and watched cartoons. As we got older, we ended up watching shows at night during the week after school. So, prime time was 8 o'clock here on the East Coast. So at 8 o'clock, we'd all settle down and watch the shows that we liked. And back then, they tried to stagger them. So you had your good shows at 8, then you had a decent show at 8:30, then you had a really good show at 9, and then you had a decent show at 9:30. So you had a solid 2 hours to watch TV. Because back, in the fall and in the winter, it was dark out and you really had nowhere to go. So you sat in front of the TV, and that was kind of the gathering spot. Was you had one TV and you try to stay warm over the winter nights, and you watch TV before you get prepared for the next day. You wanted to make sure everything was in order. You wanted to make sure that your homework was done. You knew what you were going to wear the next day at school. You wanted to make sure everything was in its place before you sat down and watched TV. And I could remember back in the 70s, just some of the shows that were on back then. They were really good. I mean, there were some shows that were really iconic. I mean, the first one that comes off that I think of is Happy Days. I mean, if you think about Happy Days, there were so many spinoffs from Happy Days. Mork and Mindy was a spinoff. Laverne and Shirley. Chachi Loves Joni comes to mind as well. But that show lasted so long. I was thinking about that the other day. I says, wow, that lasted into the 80s. So it went, through my high school years. That's how long Happy Days lasted. Richie had left the show probably the year or two before. He would just make guest appearances, but that would just go on and on. I remember when Arnold's Burnt Down is one of the last shows. And I'm thinking, whoa, Arnold's burnt down. I think that's how they had to end the show. After all that, you'd go into watching something else. So say Welcome Back, Kotter was on after Happy Days, so you had to watch Welcome Back, Kotter. And then you had to try and remember this stuff too, because you wanted to talk about this with your friends the next day, whether it be on the bus, on the way home from school, to school, at recess, at lunchtime. That's what you recapped. That's what you just spent time for. Teachers really wouldn't let you talk in school. Most of the time they didn't. I was in Catholic school, so that you weren't allowed to talk. But man, those were some of the days. Those shows that they had back then. I'm just thinking of All in the Family, MASH, Three's Company. There was iconic shows that really changed the way the world was thinking back then. We had All in the Family that had a spinoff of the Jeffersons, an African American family that lived in a building in the sky. It was an apartment in the sky. It was a very affluent area that African American people lived in back then in the 70s. Things were still a little segregated back then, but those shows seemed to catch on. Some of the other shows that I could think of, we had Sanford and Son. I think that was a really good show. We had, WKRP in Cincinnati. There was a lot of detective shows. We had Columbo, Ironside, things like that. Macmillan and Wife came out. So you always watch those. A lot of those shows were an hour long, depending what day it was on. But mainly, I think I like the comedy shows that were half hour long. Another iconic show was Three's Company. I mean, for sure. You just couldn't wait for Three's Company to come on. I mean, it was rated number one for 4 or 5 years in a row. And then a lot of the hour-long shows like The Love Boat, Fantasy Island, $6 Million Man, Dukes of Hazzard, Starsky and Hutch, things like that really entertained you for that hour. I thought that was real good quality TV back then, and something that you couldn't wait to come home from school just to watch. I mean, that was the 70s. We could go all the way to the 80s and 90s, and some of the things I just remember growing up, even before the 70s, I used to remember as a kid watching Sesame Street. That was another iconic show. Electric Company, things like that. I mean, you could just remember bits and pieces back in the late 60s, early 70s. That's still around now. I mean, people talk about that stuff now. It's just really funny how people go, oh yeah, I remember Sesame Street. I remember Mr. Rogers. I used to watch that all the time. And, so a lot of the people are gone. They passed on from those shows, but people are still talking about it today. So I find that very interesting that they're really lasting. These shows really lasted the test of time, I guess is the best way to put it. I could remember back in the 80s, jumping around here from the 60s and 70s, because I'm all over the place. There's just so many good shows out there. But man, back in the 80s, you had shows like Cheers, Miami Vice, Cosby Show, Family Ties. I mean, just some of those shows were so great. You didn't really know how good you had it back then. Because I watch some of the shows now and I'm like, well, it's not as good as Three's Company. It's not as good as Cheers. It's not as good as Seinfeld. Just remembering those shows back then. I mean, geez, you had Full House. You had Growing Pains. Even Perfect Strangers was pretty good. I always liked that dude Belky. And then you had other spin-offs. You had like The Fall Guy, which was a spin-off of... it wasn't a spinoff. Lee Majors was one of my favorite actors back then, the $6 Million Man, and he had a Fall Guy show, which was really cool. You had other, short shows like Married with Children, Saved by the Bell, Charles in Charge. Those were all good shows. I thought that they were good. They were worth watching. Just waiting for each episode, just waiting the whole week was tough. Now I know nowadays people just kind of binge watch shows, but back then you had to wait a whole week just to watch your show. It was good and bad. It was good that it made your winter go a lot faster because you're looking forward to the following week. But a lot of times you couldn't wait for that show to come. One thing comes to mind is Happy Days, whenever Fonzie was jumping over the garbage cans. I can remember it saying to be continued as he's jumping over the garbage cans. And I'm like, you mean I have to wait a whole week just to find out if he cleared the garbage cans or not? That is crazy, but that's what things evolved around back then. I mean, it was TV shows, and people don't. I feel like people nowadays don't watch TV. They don't have cable in their house now. They do a lot of streaming, like Netflixing and things like that, and just watching Hulu and Cracker and stuff like that. But TV is still mainstream in my book, and I'm still holding on to it just to watch the shows. I don't do much streaming videos, but a lot of people that I work with, the younger folk I work with, I would say that they do a lot of streaming. But you could probably talk to people around town today, and they'll remember these shows, and they'll always have a special memory. And it'll be kind of like, well, I remember we were just about to go to a meeting at night. We had a club meeting, but Happy Days was on. So I had to be a little bit late because I wanted to see what was going to happen on Happy Days. Something like that. Or Three's Company was on. I remember back in the day, whenever I used to have pen pals, you would write letters to each other. I was into wrestling back then, and I was pen pal into wrestling. And not only did you talk about wrestling, you talked about other stuff as well. You talked about TV shows, and you talked about what was the hit shows and what was going to be on and stuff like that. So you go to school and talk about it as well. Some of the things I can remember coming home from school, waiting before dinner, before the primetime shows came on, is you always had like an after school special or something like that. But one of my favorite shows for a few years was Ultraman. man, I just couldn't wait to come back to watch Ultraman. I would think about it all day, and me and my friends would be like, did you watch Ultraman yesterday? I'm like, no. He's like, oh, you missed it. Hayata got knocked out, and it was to be continued. I'm like, what? Hayata's knocked out? That was a great Japanese show. I mean, and the voiceovers were great. I mean, the voices never matched the movement of their mouth. I always thought that was funny, but, they had to put it in American words, so who knows what they were saying. Other than my cousin Joe. But I remember watching that after school. And man, Ultraman was the man back then. He fought every villain there was, every monster there was. And you always thought that he was going to lose, but he always came back and won. I love that Ultraman. There was other cartoons back then after school. I mean, there was Underdog. I used to like Underdog a lot. He'd go into a phone booth and change and come out as Underdog. I remember Superman. I remember Batman coming out. Batman, the show with Robin and the whole gang after school watching that. Superman was actually on early. I remember getting up and watching Superman with Clark Kent in black and white, probably at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I didn't have to be at school until 8, but I'd get up at 6 just to watch Superman. So definitely I was definitely into TV back then, and it wasn't like you could just lay in bed and turn it on or sleep with your TV on. Back then you had to legit get up, go in the living room, turn on the TV from the knob, go sit down or lay on the couch and watch TV. And there was no changing channels from the couch. You just sat there and watched all the advertisements and all the commercials because you'd have to get up and turn the dial. So that was kind of crazy. I mean, turning the dial nowadays, kids are probably like, what is that? Everybody's so in tune with remote. Everything is a remote now. I mean, you can watch the guide on TV. You can even talk into your remote now. So you could even say, Macmillan and wife. I don't know what it'll say. I don't know what it'll do right now. I'm pretty sure it's not going to show up, but you could talk into your remote and it's going to bring up whatever you say. Man, I'll tell you what, that was some good stuff. 70s, 80s, I really thought those were good years. I mean, 90s, there was a lot of good shows. I could remember just sitting back and waiting for the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air to come on. He had a lot of funky clothes back then. It was kind of trend-setting. And it was based in LA, which I thought was really cool. I was always into shows based in California because the shows were usually made there, but the weather was so inviting. You always wanted to be in California. You always wanted to be there just because of the weather, because of back east of all the snow and coldness. You thought that if you lived in California, you're going to live just like they did on TV, which wasn't really true. But, those shows really brought back a lot of memories. Watching some of them now. I mean, Friends been in syndication forever. I mean, that's one show that's not going to go away. Same as Seinfeld. Seinfeld, you're going to see go on forever and ever. And it doesn't matter. Sometimes they're on multiple shows. You know what I mean? Or channels. They're on multiple channels. So at the same time. So you could be watching USA and TBS, and they'll have two different Seinfeld shows on at the same time. And then sometimes you'll look at the guide on TV and it'll just say Friends every half hour, which I think is really funny. But they do that with a lot of shows. I mean, MASH could do that. Seinfeld could do that. Even Home Improvement. Home Improvement was really big with Tim Allen in the 90s as well. But right now, they could just play a loop of Home Improvement every half hour, and you could just watch that continuously. And that's the great thing about cable right now is you can go back to whatever year you want to and watch a show. And chances are you're going to see every single show because they're just going to air it every hour on the hour, which is really good, I think, because there were some shows, some variety shows that you only saw during the holidays. So take, for instance, Charlie Brown, the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. I liked all the Charlie Browns, but you only saw it during the holiday, Easter. You saw the Great Pumpkin during Halloween. Then you saw the Christmas shows. One of my favorites, all-time favorites, was, The Grinch That Stole Christmas. But you can only watch that one time on a Tuesday from 8 to 9. And if you missed that on December 21st because you were doing something else, you have to wait a whole year to see that. So back then, they didn't have videos. They didn't have any type of recording mechanism that you could tape it. When it came out, it probably came out in the 70s, but in the 60s, but I remember it in the 70s. But I'm sure they had recordings in the 80s that you can go back and watch it. But because I remember my kids having tapes of that. They'd have videotapes or DVDs of all those Christmas specials, shows that were only on during the season. There was other shows, iconic shows that I could remember as well. Hour-long shows. I mean, there was Sex in the City. There was Melrose Place, Beverly Hills 90210. I mean, who could forget those? Those were just iconic in its own right. Just the characters that people played, they're in shows now, and you remember them from, 90210 or Melrose Place. I mean, they're just synonymous with the show they starred in. And if you watched a show when you were young, that stuck with you practically the whole time through your adulthood. You knew them from that show, and sometimes you would misspeak and say that show instead of the current show that they're in. That's pretty funny. But, I think starting in the 80s, too, they came out with premium channels. They had HBO, but prior to that, it was HTH. It was Hollywood Home Theater, and they'd have premium movies that were in the theater that you had to go see and pay to watch, but then they came to TV. But then you had to buy a special box to get all these channels. So I remember my mom and dad buying us a VCR, buying us a cable box, and actually signing up for HTH. That turned into HBO. There was a lot of original shows that you could watch on HBO. They had their original material that they would show, but they'd show a lot of movies as well. I mean, you'd be able to see movies that just came out. Well, not just came out, probably a year later. Like I can remember watching Rocky as it came out on HBO, but I don't remember going to the theater to watch Rocky. I just remember watching it at home on HBO. So that's kind of stuff that I thought was really fun, where you didn't have to actually leave your house to see a movie. Nowadays, I think that's the standard. Some people do go to the box office because I think that's where they get their numbers and how people watch it. But, more people stay home and watch movies now than they ever did before. That's for sure. There was a lot of times where I could remember staying up late at night watching shows. I mean, The Honeymooners was on. Off-track betting from Yonkers, New York was on before wrestling. Saturday Night Live was on. Stuff like that I would watch. WWF was on back in the day at midnight. Sometimes there was a Florida wrestling at 1 a.m. So you're trying to stay up at night watching all these shows because you can't get enough of it. I mean, you just can't get enough of TV. And I remember that growing up as a kid was you always wanted to be near a TV to watch something because that's where you caught all your news. I know I always heard my grandparents say, we used to get our news from the radio. We didn't have TV back in the day. But then TV came around and it was black and white and it was color. And then the screens got bigger. Everybody wanted a big screen. But the point I'm trying to make is it brought family together. And I could just remember, all of us gathering in the living room and waiting for a special movie night. Maybe you pick something out in a TV guide that looked good. One movie comes to mind, one made-for-TV movie came to mind was The Devil's Triangle. Oh, man, and I couldn't wait to watch that. It was on from like 8 to 10, and I'd watch it with my sister Debbie. And we kind of liked the scary movies, so we'd watch it, and we're like, this is great. I don't know how we're going to go to sleep after this because we're going to be so scared, but man, this is fantastic now. And there was even one time I remember we were watching a scary movie, and then my mom disappeared. I'm like, Debbie, where'd mommy go? She's like, I don't know. So we actually had to look for her in the house. So she actually made a point to scare us and hide in the house. And she was behind the door that I found her in the bedroom, and she came out and scared us. But she definitely played the part, and it was always fun. And that was one thing I could always remember about my mom is she always wanted to make us happy. But there was other shows out there as well. I mean, that was a lot of mainstream shows. Everyone has their different flavor of taste. I mean, there was the A-Team out there. You could watch B.A. Brackus and all of his shenanigans that he would pull and things like that. But it was hard to keep up with all those shows. I mean, all the Barney Millers, the Taxis, the all the other shows, I can't even think of them right now, but you try to keep up with it all because all your friends watch different shows, depending what they were in. If they were into like ER, they were watching ER, but you weren't, so you were watching something else. So it was kind of fun to hear other people talk about it. I mean, there was people that were into The Simpsons, and people are still watching The Simpsons now, which I think is out of this world. That's pretty crazy, but I was never really into The Simpsons. There was a lot of shows that came out that were an hour long that people would watch and talk about that I never heard of. Twin Peaks comes to mind. I never really watched Twin Peaks. I've heard of it, but I would just skip right by it as I changed the channel. There's a King of Queens. I think that was probably from the 90s, and I thought that made a pretty good run. Shows back in the 90s, I think some of them spilled over into the 2000s. There was a lot of doctor shows, nurses shows, lawyer shows. So I think they base a lot of these shows on occupations that people play just because of what they do is very interesting. If you're a physician and working in an emergency room, you're going to have a lot of stories to tell. If you're a firefighter and you're fighting fires every day, you're going to have a story to tell. And I'd say recently, probably within the last 10 years, maybe 20 years, it could be, but reality TV has taken off. I mean, everything nowadays is reality based and it's getting the ratings. I mean, I just started recently watching Big Brother 20. I can't believe there's been 20 years of Big Brother, and I've only remembered the last 2 years that I've watched it. So it's about the same thing with Survivor. Was really never into watching Survivor, but I've always heard other people watching Survivor, and boy, they couldn't wait for that finale night. And that's kind of like Big Brother finale night. So if you watch The Bachelorette, The Bachelor, all those other reality shows, boy, people talk about that more than the mainstream shows. During the summer, they try to show you other shows just to tide you over until they get to the meat of the shows, which is in the fall. They'll send you a fall preview TV guide out, which I still get. It's basically a magazine now. TV guides in the day was a grid. Now they're just advertising and they're just pictures. It's almost like the People magazine. You could pick up a People magazine and just throw in some TV content, and there you go. There's your TV guide. That's today's TV guide is the /People magazine. One of the things I used to love about the TV guide is they used to show your horoscope. You always thought about what the future held for you, and I'm like, I'm always going to wait. Read this once a week when a TV guide comes out and see what the horoscope says as a Pisces. I always thought that was fun too, to read the back of the TV guide. But, my father saved all the TV guides, and, one of these days I'm going to have to go down and look at each one just to see. And I'm pretty sure that I'm going to remember each one, and I know that I've read each one. Well, those are all my favorite shows, and I love talking about these shows. And, to this day, I still watch all the current shows that are on. But that's for another podcast at another time. I mean, I could go on and on about all this. But that about wraps it up for this week's Right on the Mark with your host, Mark. Remember, like, subscribe, and leave your comments below. Look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.